Before Sweden had its very own coins, trade was a rather hands-on affair. Imagine a bustling Viking marketplace, not with the jingle of pocket change, but with the clatter of scales and the glint of silver. For centuries, the primary currency was not a coin with a king's face on it, but rather silver itself, measured out by weight. This system, wonderfully direct, relied on a concept known as hack silver. Vikings would carry around pieces of silver, bits of jewelry, chopped-up arm rings, fragments of plates, and even foreign coins. And when it came time to buy something, they would simply chop off a piece of the required weight. It was a brilliantly practical solution if a little untidy. This method meant that a merchant's most important tool, besides his goods, was a trusty set of scales. The value of a transaction was determined not by a number stamped on a metal disc, but by the pure, unadulterated mass of precious metal changing hands. Foreign coins were certainly present, arriving in Sweden through the vast trading networks of the Vikings. Anglo-Saxon pennies, Byzantine solidi, and particularly Arabic dirhams from the Abbasid Caliphate were common sights. These coins were valued not for their face value or the ruler they depicted, but for the silver they contained. A Viking trader might not know who Caliph Harun al-Rashid was, but he certainly knew the value of the silver in his dirhams. The sheer quantity of foreign silver found in Viking hordes across Sweden is quite staggering. It paints a picture of a society deeply connected to the wider world, from the rivers of Russia down to the markets of Baghdad. These hordes were like bank accounts buried in the ground, a testament to successful raiding and, more importantly, extensive trading. The silver was a universal language of commerce, understood by everyone from a Norse chieftain to a Persian merchant. This system worked well enough for a long time, but as trade grew more complex and society more organized, the need for a standardized, locally produced form of money became increasingly apparent. The age of simply weighing bits of metal was drawing to a close. This reliance on foreign silver and raw metal had its drawbacks. It was cumbersome, required constant weighing and testing for purity, and lacked the official guarantee of a local ruler. A standardized coin, on the other hand, represents a promise from the authority that issues it. It says, "This piece of metal is worth this much because I say so." This is a subtle but profound shift in how money works. It moves from being just a commodity to being a symbol of royal power and economic control. The stage was set for a Swedish king to make his mark, quite literally, on a piece of metal and usher in a new era of currency. The honor of introducing the very first Swedish coin goes to a king with a wonderfully evocative name, Olof Skötkonung. Around the year 995 AD, in the town of Sigtuna, not far from modern-day Stockholm, a revolutionary change took place. King Olof, who was also the first Christian king of Sweden, decided it was time for his kingdom to join the monetary club. He began minting his own coins, beautiful silver pennies that were clear imitations of the English pennies of the time, specifically those of King Ethelred the Unready. This was no accident. English pennies were widely respected and trusted across Northern Europe for their consistent weight and silver content. These early Swedish coins were a powerful statement. On one side they featured a portrait of the king, often with the Latin inscription, Olaf Rex an Sigtun, meaning Olaf, king in Sigtuna. On the other side they typically had a cross, a symbol of his new Christian faith. By putting his own name and image on the coins, Olaf was doing much more than just creating a convenient way to pay for things. He was asserting his authority, centralizing power, and announcing Sweden's arrival as a modern European kingdom. The coins were propaganda you could carry in your pocket, spreading the king's influence with every transaction. Interestingly, these first Swedish coins didn't immediately replace the old system of weighing silver. For a long time the two methods existed side by side. People might use Olaf's pennies for smaller, everyday purchases, but for larger deals, they would still bring out the hack silver and the scales. It took many decades for the population to fully trust and adopt this newfangled concept of standardized coinage. The archaeological record shows that even Olaf's own coins were sometimes snipped and chopped, treated as hack silver themselves, showing how deeply ingrained the old ways were. It was a slow and gradual transition from one economic mindset to another. The production of these coins in Sigtuna was a significant undertaking. It required skilled moneyers, individuals who knew the craft of engraving dies and striking coins with precision. Many of these early moneyers, judging by the names that appear on the coins, were likely brought in from England, bringing their expertise with them. This borrowing of technology and style is a classic theme in the history of money. Why reinvent the wheel? when you can simply copy a design that everyone already knows and trusts. Olof Skötkonung's pennies laid the foundation upon which the entire future of Swedish currency would be built, a small silver seed from which a great monetary tree would grow. As Sweden moved into the High Middle Ages, its monetary system began to evolve, though it remained a wonderfully confusing patchwork for quite some time. The basic coin was the silver penning, a descendant of Olof Skötkonung's original penny. However, these pennies were often bracteates, coins so incredibly thin they could only be stamped on one side. Imagine a piece of metal foil with a design pressed into it, and you're not far off. They were fragile, and their silver content could vary wildly from one mint to another, making trade a bit of a headache. To deal with larger sums, people didn't use bigger coins but rather units of account, the mark and the ore. These units weren't actual coins you could hold, but rather a way of counting the pennies. A mark was typically worth 8 ore, and an ore was worth 24 penninger. So 1 mark was equal to a whopping 192 pennies. This system of ghost money was common across medieval Europe and allowed merchants to calculate large values without having to physically count thousands of tiny, flimsy coins. The problem was that the actual value of a penning kept changing, as kings debased the currency by adding less silver, which meant the value of a mark in real terms was constantly shifting. It was a system that demanded a sharp mind and a healthy dose of suspicion. A major influence on Sweden's economy and coinage during this period was the Hanseatic League. This powerful network of German merchant guilds dominated trade across the Baltic Sea. They sailed their cog ships into Swedish ports like Stockholm and Visby, bringing cloth and salt, and taking away Swedish copper, iron and butter. The Hansa merchants brought their own coins and their own accounting practices, which had a profound impact. The German mark became the de facto standard for international trade, and Swedish rulers often had to adjust their own monetary systems to align with it, just to make commerce smoother. The German influence was so strong that many Swedish cities even had large German populations. This period was also marked by a chronic shortage of silver. Without a steady supply of new precious metal, it was difficult to mint enough coins to keep the economy running smoothly. This led to frequent renovatio monetae or coin renewals, where the king would declare all old coins invalid and issue new ones with a lower silver content. This was essentially a form of taxation, as people were forced to exchange their old, more valuable coins for new, less valuable ones, with the king pocketing the difference in silver. It was a clever but unpopular trick that caused a great deal of economic instability and made ordinary people deeply distrustful of the currency. The arrival of King Gustav Vasa on the throne in 1523 marked a turning point for Sweden in almost every way, including its money. Gustav Vasa was a master nation builder, and he knew that a strong, stable currency was essential for a strong, independent nation. He broke with the Catholic Church, seized its vast wealth, and used it to centralize the state and, crucially, to reform the chaotic medieval coinage. He wanted a currency that would be respected both at home and abroad, one that would put an end to the confusing mess of bracteates and fluctuating marks. His solution was to introduce a large, impressive silver coin called the daler. The daler was inspired by the large silver coins being minted elsewhere in Europe, most famously the German Joachimsthaler, from which we get the word dollar. Gustav Vasa's first dollar was struck in 1534, and it was a magnificent piece of work. It was large, heavy, and made of high-quality silver, featuring a realistic portrait of the king himself. This was a world away from the flimsy, abstract bracteates of the Middle Ages. The daler was a coin that radiated power and stability. It announced that Sweden was a serious European power, with a monarch in firm control, capable of guaranteeing the value of his money. Alongside the prestigious silver daler, Gustav Vasa's reforms also standardized the smaller coins used for everyday transactions. He continued to mint the mark and the ore, but now they were actual coins, not just units of account. The system was set up so that 1 daler was equal to 3 mark, which in turn was equal to 24 ore. This created a more logical and user-friendly monetary ladder, from the small copper ore for buying bread to the grand silver daler for major business deals. For the first time, Sweden had a coherent, multi-denominational currency system that was entirely under royal control, minted centrally in Stockholm. This monetary overhaul was part of Gustav Vasa's broader economic strategy. He took control of Sweden's valuable mines, particularly the copper mine at Falun and the silver mine at Sala. This gave him direct access to the raw materials needed to produce his new currency. By controlling the supply of metal, he could control the supply of money, giving the state unprecedented power over the national economy. The introduction of the daler was more than just a currency reform. It was a declaration of economic sovereignty that broke the old dependence on Hanseatic standards and set Sweden on a new financial path. The extreme awkwardness of carrying around enormous copper plates naturally created a demand for a more convenient alternative. If you owned a 10-daler copper plate weighing 20 kilograms, you wouldn't want to lug it to the market. Instead, you would deposit it at a bank and receive a piece of paper, a receipt that certified you were the owner of that specific plate. These deposit certificates were far easier to carry and trade. People soon realized that instead of going back to the bank to retrieve the heavy plate, they could just trade the paper certificate itself. This was the moment the banknote was born in Europe. This brilliant idea was pioneered by a man named Johan Palmstruck, who founded the Stockholm's Banco in 1657. In 1661, his bank began issuing the first official banknotes in European history. These were called kreditivsedlar, or credit notes, and were initially fully backed by the copper money held in the bank's vaults. You could, in theory, walk into the bank at any time and exchange your piece of paper for the corresponding amount of clunky metal. This made commerce infinitely easier. It was a revolutionary concept, money that had value not because of the material it was made from, but because of the promise it represented. However, the temptation to print more notes than there was metal in the vaults proved too great for Palmstruck. The bank began lending out money by printing new notes that were not backed by actual deposits, a practice we now call fractional reserve banking. Initially, this stimulated the economy, but soon the bank had issued far too many notes. Public confidence collapsed, leading to a run on the bank as everyone tried to exchange their paper for copper at once. The bank couldn't pay, and it failed spectacularly in 1667. Johan Palmstruck, once a celebrated innovator, was sentenced to death for mismanagement, though his sentence was later commuted. Although Stockholm's Banco failed, the idea of paper money was too good to disappear. The Swedish parliament, the Riksdag, learned from the disaster. In 1668 they established a new bank, the Riksstanders which we now know as the Riksbank. It is the world's oldest central bank. The Riksbank took over the business of issuing banknotes but under much stricter government control to prevent the kind of overprinting that had doomed its predecessor. This laid the foundation for modern central banking, not just in Sweden but around the world, all thanks to the initial problem of trying to avoid carrying around gigantic pieces of copper. The 18th and 19th centuries were a period of much-needed monetary tidying up for Sweden. After the chaotic experiments with plate money and the early drama of banknotes, the focus shifted towards creating a stable and predictable system. For much of this time, the primary unit of currency was the riksdaler, which itself existed in several confusing forms, tied to different metal standards, one for silver, the riksdaler specie, and another for copper. This complexity was a hangover from previous eras and a constant source of frustration for merchants and ordinary citizens alike. The great challenge was to unify these different standards into a single, coherent currency. A major step forward came in 1777 with the monetary reform of King Gustav III. This reform officially tied the Swedish currency to a silver standard, making the silver riksdaler the foundation of the entire system. This helped to stabilize the value of the currency and simplify accounting, bringing Sweden more in line with the monetary practices of other major European nations. However, the Napoleonic Wars in the early 19th century threw things into disarray again, causing massive inflation and forcing a temporary return to inconvertible paper money. It seemed that every step towards order was followed by a stumble back into chaos. The final decisive move towards modernity came in the second half of the 19th century. First came decimalization. In 1855, a reform was passed that divided the riksdaler into 100 ore. This swept away the medieval system of dividing currency into 24 or 48 parts, replacing it with the simple, logical decimal system that was becoming the global standard. This made calculations immensely easier for everyone, from schoolchildren to international bankers. It was a rational reform for a rational age, streamlining commerce and making finance more accessible to the general population. The biggest change of all occurred in 1873. Sweden decided to abandon the silver standard and join the new gold standard. To mark this momentous shift, they also introduced an entirely new currency, the krona, meaning crown. The krona replaced the riksdollar at a rate of 1-to-1. At the same time, Sweden, along with Denmark and later Norway, formed the Scandinavian Monetary Union. Under this agreement, the kroner of all three countries were interchangeable and legal tender in each nation. This was a remarkable act of economic cooperation, creating a large, stable currency zone across Scandinavia that lasted until the outbreak of World War I. The 20th century subjected the Swedish krona to a series of intense pressures, forcing it to adapt and change. The first major shock was World War I, which shattered the Scandinavian Monetary Union and ended the gold standard. Like many countries, Sweden had to change the metals used for its coins, as nickel and copper were redirected for the war effort. Suddenly, coins made of iron began to appear in people's pockets, a stark and heavy reminder of the ongoing conflict. The designs often remained the same, but the material itself told a story of scarcity and crisis. This pattern repeated itself during World War II, when iron coins were once again minted to conserve more valuable metals. After the wars, as Sweden developed into a prosperous welfare state, its coinage reflected this stability. The designs became more modern and streamlined, often featuring the monarch's profile in a clean, contemporary style. A notable figure from this era was the coin engraver Leo Holmgren, who designed many of the coins used in the latter half of the 20th century, creating a consistent and recognizable aesthetic for the Swedish krona. However, inflation, a gentle but persistent force throughout the post-war decades, began to take its toll. The smallest denominations, the 1 and 2 ore coins, lost their purchasing power and were eventually withdrawn from circulation in the 1970s. The late 20th and early 21st centuries saw an acceleration of this trend. The 5, 10, and 25 ore coins followed the 1 and 2 ore into history, deemed too costly to produce relative to their tiny value. The most significant change came in 2016, when Sweden undertook a complete overhaul of its coins and banknotes. All of the older coins, including the familiar silver-colored 1 krona and the large 5 krona, were declared invalid. They were replaced by a new series of smaller, lighter coins, designed to be cheaper to produce and easier to handle. The old 50-ore coin was removed entirely, making the 1 krona the lowest denomination coin in circulation. This move was also driven by another powerful force, the rise of digital payments. Sweden has become one of the most cashless societies in the world. Many Swedes rarely use physical money, preferring to pay with cards, mobile apps like Swish, or other digital methods. This has led to a dramatic decrease in the number of coins and banknotes needed for the economy to function. The withdrawal of old coins and the introduction of a more limited new set reflect this new reality. The jingle of coins in the pocket, once a ubiquitous sound of daily life, is becoming increasingly rare in modern Sweden. As of today, in 2025, the Swedish coin landscape is a model of modern simplicity. Following the great changeover of 2016, only 4 denominations remain in active circulation: the 1 krona, the 2 krona, the 5 krona, and the 10 krona. The ore, which had been a part of Swedish life for nearly 1,000 years, now exists only in electronic accounting. It has vanished completely from physical currency. The current coins are smaller and lighter than their predecessors, with the 1 and 2 krona coins being copper-plated steel, and the 5 krona a golden-colored Nordic gold alloy, the same material used for the Euro 50-cent piece. The 10 krona coin, a survivor from the previous series, also remains in its familiar Nordic gold form. The designs on these new coins are a blend of tradition and modernity. The 1 krona, 2 krona, and 5 krona coins all feature the portrait of the current monarch King Carl XVI Gustav on the obverse side. The reverse designs are simple and elegant, displaying the national coat of arms or the numerical value. The 2 krona coin was a reintroduction, having been absent from circulation for over 40 years, adding a little novelty to the new set. These coins are designed by the artist Ernst Norden, and they present a unified contemporary image for Sweden's physical currency in an increasingly digital age. In a curious twist of economic fate, Sweden no longer mints its own coins. The historic Swedish mint, Myntverket, which could trace its lineage back for centuries, ceased operations in Eskilstuna in 2011. The production of Swedish currency has been outsourced, and since 2008, The country's coins have been struck by the Mint of Finland. This means that the coins used in Stockholm today are actually made in Helsinki. It's a practical, cost-effective solution in an era of declining demand for physical cash, but it marks a quiet end to a very long history of domestic coin production. Beyond the coins used for everyday shopping, the Riksbank also issues commemorative coins to mark special royal occasions, cultural milestones, and scientific achievements. Perhaps the most famous of these are the Nobel Prize medals, which are also produced under the purview of the Swedish authorities. While not currency, these medals, struck in gold and bearing the image of Alfred Nobel, are arguably Sweden's most famous and prestigious minted objects. They continue the long tradition of using expertly crafted metal discs to honor greatness, a practice that connects the digital world of 2025 all the way back to the silver pennies of the first Viking kings.